Hi everyone, welcome to today's EuroSTAR webinar, 10 Great But Now Overlooked Tools with Graham Thomas. If you have any questions for Graham during the webinar, please type them into your control panel on the right hand side of your screen and I will put them to Graham at the end of the webinar. All the slides and material will be posted on the EuroSTAR website at the end of the webinar. If you want to join the conversation on Twitter, you can do so using the following hashtags and Twitter handles. Now, without further ado, I'll pass you over.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Oh gosh, just over 100. Yes, 10 great but now overlooked tools. Thank you for joining. Right. Okay, the background to this presentation started at EuroSTAR 2011 at the Gala Dinner. After the Gala Dinner on the coach on the way home, hence the pretty picture of a coach, I was in a fairly animated discussion with a couple of people, and I was saying I was getting annoyed by all these industry luminaries who turn up at conferences and say, don't do all that stuff I said 5 years ago, do this now. And I was sort of expressing a sense of frustration because 5 years ago I was trying to do the things they were telling me to do then, only to find out that I shouldn't be doing them. As we were talking, I realized how many simple and effective tools we no longer use because they'd either become overlooked or we don't use them because they've become redundant. And I wondered if those tools were worth looking at again, starting with my humble flowcharting template. You can see on the right there I still have a 1980s vintage IBM programming template, complete in its original paper wrapper. And I think I thought I'd probably overlooked my flowcharting template for too long. And if there are tools so those tools we may have forgotten. And I also thought if there are tools we've forgotten, then surely there are some tools we should forget, and I wonder what those might be. When I made this presentation at the EuroSTAR Conference in Amsterdam 2012, the conference theme was innovation and renovation. So for renovation, I was very clearly talking about tools that we had overlooked and we could maybe use again. For innovation, I challenged myself to deliver the presentation, which also included 2 mind mapping sessions using a Raspberry Pi. And I can hear some of you saying, a what? The Raspberry Pi is a $35 credit card sized computer that runs a version of Linux. You can find out all the details at raspberrypi.org. Don't worry, I'm not trying to sell them. The Raspberry Pi was developed to help kids learn to program. This is for children, school children. And I thought, as testers, shouldn't we also be teaching them how to test? Actually, using the Raspberry Pi on the day wasn't that easy. I had a couple of technology problems, but the presentation went seamlessly. Unfortunately, we can't use the Raspberry Pi today because it doesn't run Windows software. It's a Linux machine. If you're ever stuck for a good picture to use in a slideshow, go no further than the NASA image of the day. This is the last shuttle night landing. I think the picture looks fantastic, and the cheesy analogy that I'm going to use is I'm attempting to land this agenda. Insert your own cheesy agenda when you use NASA pictures. So what we're going to do today is we'll have a brief introduction. I'll have a General Moan. That should be fun. I'll talk about tools we've forgotten. I'll talk about tools we should forget. Then I'll summarise. And in line with this year's EuroSTAR 2013 conference theme, it is about questioning and questioning testing. So I'll try and be as brief as I can, and I'll give you time at the end to ask me questions. Okay, so let's press on. So my General Moan. Before I do that, if you look on the right-hand side of this screen here, at the top you can, probably very few people have ever seen one of these or used one. It's actually a card typing, punching terminal. This was the first computer terminal I ever used. It's not actually connected to a computer or to the computer I was using. On the right-hand side, punched cards are slotted in. The keyboard actually sits in the middle, but I think they've moved it to the right. And in the middle you can see a little punch card. You type in, and then what you type is punched on the card in hex, and in little cutouts on the card, and then the cards are stacked up on the left-hand side. That was how I wrote my first computer program, an awful long time ago, I must admit. Below that you see a Sinclair ZX81. That was my first real computer back in actually 1982, not 1981. They were wonderful things, hardly ever worked. When they did, they were brilliant and great fun. Nice black and white screens and clunky graphics. Below is my current netbook. I've had it about a year. It runs on an Intel Atom chip. It's really frighteningly powerful, has huge amounts of memory, and does just about everything I can think of doing, even playing HD video. At the bottom you can see a Raspberry Pi, which is the credit card size computer, which has slightly less power than my netbook, but is in every way as functional, if not more so. So it's an old subject, overlooked tools. It sort of lends itself to a good old blast of nostalgia. Things were better in my day, back when it was hard, and now it's all too easy, etc., etc. Well, I'm not going to moan in that way. I think I'm more productive than I have ever been in the workplace. Things that were really hard 5, 10, 20 plus years ago are really easy now. The level of platform integration we have today is just frightening, though. I have cloud storage, Dropbox, on my smartphone. That's nothing spectacular, apart from when you think I can go almost anywhere on the planet and interact. But yet with all these obvious advances, I still see people struggling with the basics, which is worrying that in our industry we haven't yet put these in place yet. So obviously we have a way to go to mature. But for now, that's my general moan over. We'll look at some tools that have fallen into disuse and may be ripe for resurrection. So now here's my list of tools that we've forgotten. Now, before I go through the list, it's quite possible that everyone listening is doing all of these things or using all of these tools and is wondering what on earth I'm talking about. I think that unlikely. However, there may just be someone. What is important to bear in mind is that I'm not being critical about your current practices here. I'm just trying to say that there may be some tools that you could also use or can consider for use but might not know about. And why have I come up with this list? Partly it's because some of these things I've stopped using, and partly it's because when I work with people I see that they aren't aware of these things that may help them. Flowcharts. Oh, sorry, I didn't read out the list. Let me go back. So my list is flowcharts, prototypes, project plans, mind maps, tools we already have at our disposal, and I'll suggest some of these. Aptitude tests, hexadecimal calculators, desk checking, data dictionaries, and workbenches. Okay, so I'll move forward now. So the first tool, flowcharts. You can tell this is a conference presentation, so I've got some questions here for the audience, which is going to be a bit of a challenge for you to answer. So my questions would be, have you ever, and I'll answer them, but have you ever seen a flowchart? Have you ever used one? And who's ever drawn a flowchart? Well, most people have seen a flowchart. There's one on the right-hand side, which is from an EU flowchart about a budgeting process. Have we ever used flowcharts? A lot of people, well, quite a few of us have used flowcharts. But when you ask how many people have drawn flowcharts, not so many have actually drawn them. They're making a comeback though. The netbook that I showed you on the previous screen, in the user manual, which was all of 2 pages long, the back page was a flowchart about the support process, which is basically how not to contact the company. But flowcharts are so easy to do. All you actually need is a pencil or a template or some form of recording. I know smartphones, electronic and digital recording, and pens. Very simple to do. Okay. So here is a flowchart. I'm going to attempt to use the laser pointer here. This should be fun. So they're quite simple flowcharts, but they show flow, they show process, they show logic. You can dry run a flowchart, you can write code from a flowchart. They're easily understood, but they are easy to make mistakes. You can see the start, that's the start and stop process, symbol, the decision symbol, an input symbol, a process symbol, and you can see the lines joining together the symbols. And from that you can, they're quite visual, you can pretty simply see what's going on. I'm going to go through in detail a flowchart in a bit, not this particular one, but this was one that I drew to illustrate flowcharts still have relevance today, and I drew it for a testing retreat meeting about a year ago. I actually made a mistake when I was drawing the flowchart, so that proved that they were actually easy to make mistakes, but I'd used a digital pen, which is why some of the lines don't quite line up properly, and with my digital pen I could just click undo, and then I could click redo and draw a new line in the right place, whereas with a pencil I'd have had to use a rubber or an eraser. Flowcharts 2.0 came along in the form of Jackson structured programming structure diagrams. They were elegant but not as easy. You could still make mistakes in them, and actually I did make mistakes, and there's probably one or two on the diagram I have in front of you if you're familiar with the diagrams. They're much harder to draw when multiple processes are used. They were specifically designed for file processing, but I actually think they led to the demise of flowcharts because they were designed around, flowcharts enable you to write code with go-tos. We used to call it spaghetti code, whereas a Jackson structure diagram, you can't. There are no go-tos in a structure diagram. So you have to write processes. They have a flow which is down and from left to right across the page. Decisions are identified by a circle and iterations by an asterisk. They do look more elegant though. However, they're not as easy to understand because on this example here, spell check is performed twice, so it's therefore a called procedure, and the details of it are held elsewhere. Whereas what I'll show you on the next slide is when you line up a flowchart against a Jackson structure chart, you find that you lose some of the logic and the processing flow, whereas with the flowchart you can still see that visually. But I think that the drive towards structured code, structured programming, and the eradication of the go-to statement meant that we began to lose flowcharts from IT. Okay, so as it says in the advert, still working. And it might surprise you that flowcharts still work after 30 years. In fact, they work remarkably well, considering they teach the basics of logic, which one would think was essential for most forms of programming, and they're pictorial and easy to draw after learning only a few simple steps. Here's a flowchart which you might find helpful. You might suddenly be sitting there thinking, am I a horse? And here's a helpful flowchart that I found on the internet. So start. Question, are you a horse? If you say no, well obviously you're not a horse, so you stop. If you say yes, or even if you say maybe, we then ask you another question, which is how many legs do you have? If you have 2 legs, well clearly you're not a horse. But if you have 4, we ask a supplementary question, which is really. And you can see we end up at the same place even if you answer yes or no. And we ask, can you read and write? If the answer is no, then you must be a liar because you're reading this, so therefore you're not a horse. There used to be lots of flowcharts in bars which had lots to do with drinking and falling over. But you can see there's a humorous side to flowcharts as well, but it very simply explains how flowcharts work and how the logic and processing works. Prototypes. There were 3 basic types of prototype. There's Hollywood set, as you can see here in the, it's a complete fabrication. It doesn't work. It looks good from the outside, but that's all it does. You can build functional but going to be discarded, so no bells and whistles. When I was a programmer, I reckon that 60 to 80% of the code I wrote was error handling. So you're saving a huge amount by not writing any error handling or code, and you can tolerate errors. Or they may be the functional basis for a new system, but that you need to prototype some elements and may well go through a rapid development phase. So why we have prototypes? Well, back when, it took so long to build a system that your stakeholders, and I know I've spelled that wrong now, I couldn't resist, when your stakeholders wanted a look before you did too much damage. If it was taking you 3 or 4 years to build a system, or it was taking you quite a lot of investment and re-engineering, you didn't want to build a system and then worry about whether it worked or not. Of course, not everybody produced prototypes, but what a useful tool they were. I think one of the real advantages they gave, apart from design, validation and processing flow visualization, was that you could do early usability testing before you cut any code. I suspect nowadays that we're rushing so fast to cut working code that examining in depth how the system's going to be used just looks a bit like a luxury. And with so many apps now being banged out as disposable commodities for phones, I think we're further away than ever from considering usability and other things that we used to do with prototypes. And especially powerful if you are adopting an iterative or a risk-based approach, especially if you have high-risk areas you may wish to mitigate early, like new architecture, extreme loads, or critical processing. Project plans. Most people will be familiar with the Gantt chart on the top on the right-hand side. Less people will be familiar with fewer people will be familiar with a critical path network and the critical path, which is highlighted in red. Those are both created from the same sets of tasks and activities. They look significantly different. That is, all I've done is I've put in the dependencies between the activities, sometimes called logic. So when did project plans get abolished? I know that engineers still use them. I don't mean plans in Excel or worse still PowerPoint. I mean proper plans with scheduling, dependencies, effort and resourcing. Surely it's a skill that's even more in need, judging by IT's continued inability to deliver anywhere near on time to budget or of the desired quality. I was taught decades ago in college that the US military, fed up with how their projects always went out of control, invented the critical path method. So why not use this 50-plus-year-old tool? The US military couldn't build their rockets kept on blowing up, so they invented the critical path method to ensure that they had repeatability of and control of the process. And as Yosa would say, puzzles me greatly, this does, why we don't do proper project plans. I think, and I'll make this point later, I'll talk about project plans later. I think it's because we're all familiar with seeing Gantt charts, but not everyone is shown how to encode dependencies and develop critical paths. Mind maps. For those of you that know me or have seen me at a conference, you might think that I do nothing else than run sessions developing mind maps, or people think that mind maps are really popular and underused all the time. Unfortunately, in my experience, they aren't. I've attended too many workshops, brainstorming. I'm not sure we can say this anymore, but brainstorming sessions, sort of thought showers or idea puddles, they're sometimes called, where one of the primary tools just isn't used. It not only isn't used, but isn't even known about. I use FreeMind because it's free. It's easy for me because I probably don't belong to many of the organisations I work for, so I don't have the same restrictions that people do. It does puzzle me sometimes that free software is harder to procure in an enterprise organisation and run on the desktop than paid-for software. I do find that puzzling. I know people have often said to me, yes, I want to get the mind mapping tool, but we can't load it on our system because it's free. I do find that puzzling. What you'll see on the right-hand side is a is the Mapper Monday. It's a medieval map in Hereford Cathedral. This is actually a high contrast version. The real version you can't actually see unless you stand in a darkened room. I view this, although it was produced about 700 years ago, it was everything that the monks who drew it knew at the time about the world. I view it very much as a mind map, although I think our first mind maps were probably the early cave paintings that were done 30, 40, 50,000 years ago. Okay, how to mind a map. Right, so here's a simple mind map. It's not mine. If you enter how to mind map into your favorite search engine, I suspect this will be the first image that you encounter. I think it illustrates quite well the power of mind maps and how to draw them. On the left hand side are some just 8 memoirs. These come straight out of the Tony and Barry Buzan book, the Mind Map book. 8 simple steps. Start at the center of the page. Don't be serious. Free associate. Think as fast as you can go. There are no boundaries. Don't judge too fast. Go, go, go. So keep up the pace. And then add the relationships and connections afterwards. If you follow those 8 simple steps, you'll draw pretty good mind maps. You can read their book by all means about how to draw mind maps. But there's nothing easier than actually downloading some of the many free tools that are available and starting to use them yourself. Stuff that's already there. On the right hand side you can see a Google Doodle. I don't know if many of you are familiar with those. They're on Google's homepage. This one was done to celebrate Alan Turing's 100th birthday, June 23rd last year. If you have the time, it's fun to use and try and work out the binary processing that's going on. Google and search engines are in general fantastic search and information tools if used with a little caution. But so if you think, for people who can remember IT before we all had a terminal on our desk, a personal computer, a laptop, a phone with more processing capacity and storage than mainframe computers I've used, or even swishy-wishy tablets, then it might come as a surprise to you to know that it wasn't always so. And some of the simplest tools, like the snipping tool in Windows 7, would seem like science fiction only a few short decades ago. And there are so many more tools that just aid productivity. And it's interesting for me to look back because I think I wasted some of my best years doing these things manually before we had tools to do them. Most of these tools are free and they're already there, but we don't use them, possibly because we don't know about them. The snipping tool in Microsoft Windows first turned up in Vista. It just cuts images off the screen. I see people struggling with trying to get images off the screen. I'm thinking, Microsoft have built a tool to do this, and actually in its current incarnation it works quite well. Other tools, Skype. We're on a webinar today, so we're all familiar with that. We talk a lot about co-location in our projects, especially the Agile guys. Skype gives you virtual co-location. It's fantastic. The business version and video and instant messaging tools are just great for this. Fantastic for communication, and there's so much to being able to see someone you're actually talking to. It's a different level of communication. I mean, Twitter, personally I think use with caution, but it's a great way to use the power of your crowd. So build your crowd, you can then use your crowd, although sometimes it isn't quite about using the power of the crowd. SMS. We all know about text messaging, but I find sometimes you phone someone, you can't get hold of them. Send them a text message and they get back to you. Some people have different levels of communication with mobile phones. And SMS is it's interesting, where people won't return your calls. They may well return your text. The purple icon with the N is OneNote, a great tool that's been in Microsoft Office for a few years now, that very few people use. A really useful, powerful, connected and integrated tool that's hardly ever used. Fantastic. And finally, cloud storage, Dropbox or whatever your flavor. You can have more free cloud storage available to you now anywhere in the world than you could get on a mainframe computer 30 years ago. I find that frightening. Aptitude tests. When I started in IT, I had to sit an aptitude test. In fact, for my first 3 jobs I had as a programmer, I had to sit an aptitude test to show that I had some reasoning and logical thinking capability before an employer would invest hugely in training me and then letting me loose on their vastly expensive computer systems. I want to ask why has the industry stopped doing this? Was this never a good thing? Mind you, looking at some of the people who did pass the aptitude tests, you had to wonder, but to not do it at all is surely crazy. And I don't mean the feeble attempts at test certification that we currently have. I can hear Twitter buzzing away as I speak. Those in no way match up to the logic and reasoning tests that were being used only 30 years ago. And my question really is, and it's a question really because we don't have one, is where is the software testing, reasoning and logical thinking aptitude test? The real differentiation I make between the kind of testing we do, the tests that we have at the moment, is there's a real difference between finding out what people can do rather than what people know. And I think these the logic and reasoning aptitude tests that we used to give to programmers were very good at finding out what they could do. Hexadecimal calculators. For my first 15 years in IT, I needed a hexadecimal calculator. You can see my Casio FX451 on the right there. Actually, after 27 years, it's given up the ghost. The battery's finally lost its ability to hold a charge with the solar panel. Unless I shine a very strong light on it, it won't work. But I always seem to be able to, always seem to have to convert from binary to hex and decimal. Even octal work with 6 and 8-bit bytes, but I don't anymore. Yeah, so my solar power calculator worked under fluorescent light, had 10 digits. Wow, that was a real innovation. I mean, we think back, it wasn't until 1976 that pocket calculators were cheap enough to be afforded by all, and yet they're just an expected part of modern day life. But actually in software testing, I just don't need a calculator like that anymore. And why is that? Is it that software testing isn't that difficult? It isn't computer science? See? What's gone wrong? Honestly, I thought it was good to feel like a nerd. It's like you had a special skill. And I now have an app on my not-so-smart phone for this, but it doesn't feel the same, and I hardly ever need to use it. And actually, all of this functionality and more is available in the humble Windows calculator, especially the programmer view, which would have been a marvel in the 1980s. So there's another tool in the stuff that's already there category. And P.S. if you think I've forgotten about the Raspberry Pi and Linux, Linux versions of very functional scientific calculators are also available. Desk checking. It may come as no surprise to discover that when I started my programming career, the team I worked in had 1 terminal between 6 people. You had to book a slot to use it. Machine time was too valuable to key in program code. That had to be sent away and printed onto cards. Programmers' time was also expensive, and terminals were too expensive, although for me that all changed within about a year. Because it was actually cheaper in machine resource to check your code visibly before running than to run it, find you had a failure, crash the machine, print out a dump. I remember the days you would turn up in the morning and your desk would be covered in about 6 or 8 boxes of listing paper, and operations weren't very happy with you. This isn't one of those "it was better in my day" tales though, because desk checking was a valuable debugging tool. We as humans have the mental capacity to do these things. This is before interactive debugging even, and I agree that the landscape is far more complex today, but I think some of the core desk checking skills and debugging thinking skills have been lost. There's actually no penalty for making mistakes now. In fact, it's becoming quicker to make a mistake and then fix it than to avoid making it in the first place. I mean, if you think the whole development approach is predicated on this as testing in production. And it's an interesting argument about whether we should focus on avoiding making mistakes or focus on fixing them very quickly. Ideally we should do both, but not to the exclusion. And I used to check my desk every day when I went into work, and unsurprisingly it always had 6 legs. So I've rolled two tools together here, data dictionaries and workbenches. I was an ICL man. VME was the best operating system ever. It doesn't exist anymore. You could just log onto a mainframe and start doing stuff, which is really powerful stuff long before Unix, something which IBM never allowed on their mainframes. And with VME, you got a data dictionary that could build transaction processing services and define relational databases. And if you had the right utilities, you could generate application code for TP and batch that just worked. The only testing you needed to do was to ensure that you had the requirements and design right. There was no need for constructional unit or even system testing at all. But somehow that seemed to go out of fashion. Yet 20 years later you see people struggling with problems that IT's already produced working solutions for, but has in the intervening years somehow forgotten, unlearned or discarded as inferior. And I do wonder why that has happened. Anyway, to put the mainframes of the 1980s into perspective, and you might think I've switched the labels around on the photos. The top photo is an ICL 2966 mainframe computer, and there's a Raspberry Pi below. The Raspberry Pi has 512 megabytes of memory. It has more system memory than a mainframe from 30 years ago, and you can plug in more storage with a USB stick than, well, many more racks of disks than you can see in the picture above. Okay, so those are my whiz through tools that I think we've forgotten that we could look again at using, but I also think there are some things that we should do away with. So my Z list, when I got to this point of the presentation, what I didn't want to do was to be really, really negative. I could come up with a very long list of things to stop doing, but here's a couple. Plans in Excel or PowerPoint, the good today or bad tomorrow. I've seen the light speech I was talking about earlier. Nostalgia, pretty much what I've been doing in this presentation so far. And lists, I hate presentations which say 10 of this or 7 of that. And I'm doing exactly the same. So guilty as charged on several of these points. For example, project plans. I said I'd talk about project plans, come back to talk about them. Some people just don't know about logic and dependencies in project planning, or how to create a critical path network in Microsoft Project. People just create Gantt charts, so they don't use the power of dependencies. I was asked recently in a workshop how to display the dependency network in Microsoft Project. So I answered, and I said, you click on the resources view, and you click on the drop down, and under it is a network diagram. And this person said, and then I was asked, well, how long's that been in Microsoft Project? Quite as if it was my fault that this person didn't know. And I found that I couldn't stop myself from saying, oh, I don't know, 20 years or so, ever since the beginning. It's always been there. But what it showed to me was that people don't know, and this lack of basic knowledge has led to bad practices. And I would illustrate that by planning in Excel or worse PowerPoint, because people think planning is just Gantt views and they're just pictures, whereas actually the real power of planning, the logic and dependencies and the effort and estimating, is not available to them. I think it's quite an interesting discussion actually in the industry now, with, if you can imagine, a lot of planning is now taking place with post-it notes on whiteboards. So we're at an interesting place in the industry on this one. The good today, bad tomorrow. Good today, so there's my expert telling me do all these things, and then 5 years later they turn up and say, no, it's bad. So you'll find out the stuff you're doing now is bad, even though you were told by these experts like me that turn up at conferences. And they say things like, don't do that, do this. And almost ridiculing. I've seen it. I saw this somewhere. Somebody did this at a conference. I was appalled. The speaker stood there and ridiculed the audience for practices. And they make you feel embarrassed, small, insignificant. So actually it's one of these cult enlightenment experiences. You promise to do what they tell you. God, a subtitle for this presentation was going to be 10 inspirational ideas that ruined my career. And only you realise that 5 years ago the expert who's telling you to do the great stuff now was standing there telling you to do the stuff you're doing. That's the bad thing. So this is the hook that got me into the presentation. So actually, sometimes you need to take it with a pinch of salt to really do take a critical view of what people are telling you, including me. The picture on the right, I do like that. I was going to use a picture of my good friend Jeff Thompson here. I didn't, because many people confuse us, and also he might actually find out, because a webinar is quite a public event. Although I think this chap I'm sure Jeff isn't listening, so actually this chap looks quite a little bit like Jeff, if you know him. So what am I saying? I'm saying beware of what I'm saying. I hope I've not made anyone feel small or insignificant in what I've been saying today. That's not been my intention. And I promise not to turn up in 5 years' time and say, you know, all that overlooked tool stuff, I promise I won't do that. So in summary, here's some technology that we shouldn't resurrect. Punch cards. The days before terminals and we could actually see what we were doing with computers. Paper tape. An operator once told me that paper tape was the best form of data storage. I just laughed. 8-inch floppy disks. I can see the picture there, 3.5-inch, 5-inch and 8-inch floppy disks. You really felt like you were on a mission when you walked down the corridor carrying an 8-inch floppy disk. Slide rules. Use the Windows calculator. Anything where you have to do the calculation several times and then average the results is a bit questionable. However, that technology did get us into space. So, a number of you are sitting there now thinking, oh, that was great, Graham, or maybe it wasn't, but what does it mean for me? Well, I hope this session has been useful and will help you to look again at tools and techniques that you may no longer use but may still be beneficial. And maybe, hopefully, there's some tools that you can now go away at and look at possibly using. And I also hope that you'll also review some of the tools and techniques that you are using and ask if they really are the best, most efficient and effective ways of getting the job done. Although, don't throw everything away, only the things you can improve on. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll now hand you back to Dara for some information, and he'll then manage questions.
Thanks, Graham. It's actually Paul here. Dara isn't on the call this time. We'll start taking questions now. If anybody has any questions for Graham, just type them into the control panel and I'll ask them to Graham. Just before we go on to that, I'll just draw your attention to the EuroSTAR webinar archive, where we now have a total of 65 or 66 webinars which are available on demand. We also have a host of other software testing content, including presentations, videos, podcasts, and over 20 ebooks from testers from all around Europe and throughout the world. I'll also draw your attention to the super early bird offer, which expires this Friday. That allows you to save up to €430 on your conference price. So make sure you register before then to get the best price on conference registrations. The first question here, Graham, is from Catherine Mahan. She says that she used flowcharts when she started programming in 1977 and asks, can you still get templates?
I have no idea is the honest answer to that. I treasure my templates like gold, but to be honest, I think many of the tools will draw the boxes. If you actually look at Visio, in the name of the tools in Visio is exactly the flowcharting template. The name of the symbol is exactly the same as it was in the flowcharting templates of 30 years ago. Although very few of us now use manual input, output, drum storage devices. It's quite interesting, that one.
Okay, another question from Alexander Ivanov. Do you have a list of freeware that you can recommend for the purposes
of software testing?
I guess that's what he means. The question just tails off.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't have a long list of tools. There are lots of lists of freeware. I think the list that I did give, the reference that or the tools that I mentioned was FreeMind, which, if you put that into Google, will lead you to SourceForge. I think in terms of what I was talking about here. I've been talking about approaches as tools. So sorry I haven't got a list of technical tools. Use this one, use that one. That's maybe something I should look into.
Here's a more specific question on freeware tools then, Graham, from Martin Diamond. Is there a good freeware tool for data modeling?
I have no idea. I'm not a data modeler. I'm sorry. But I mean, it's good that people are thinking, all right, there might be some freeware tools around. I mean, I could find out. I suspect that you probably find as much information from Google as I could. It's an interesting question.
And a question from Cindy Phillips. What is your #1 recommended tool, and under what circumstances can it be best used?
I mean, that's a good one. My #1 recommended tool. I'll assume that was out of the 10 that I was talking about. I would say mind mapping, and I would say under all circumstances, and mind mapping tools can be run on phones with Android apps. They're all free, or on PCs, laptops, or actually you could draw mind maps with a pencil and a piece of paper. So I'd say mind mapping. And sorry, when I talk about circumstances, you can do absolutely anything in a mind map. You can do a document plan, you can write notes, minutes from a meeting in mind maps, or you can just have creative thoughts and ideas. They're really, really powerful once you get to use them.
A question from Smita Mishra here. Just wants to check again on your desk checking. Not sure I could gauge if you are for it or against it, or whether you'd recommend to do away with it.
I was definitely for desk checking. However, I think a lot of desk checking can now be done interactively in code, especially it depends on what tools. If you're using some of the Microsoft tools, some of the conformance to standards and templates is excellent. The way the tool can draw wavy lines under what you've written to tell you you've made a mistake is very clever. So I think, was I for or against? I was for it because it taught you the techniques for checking, for debugging. I think that was a really useful technique that maybe some of our programmers may have lost, and I think they're really useful techniques for testers as well.
And this next question is from Jane Nosegard Larson. Aren't visualization tools recommended in general, no matter which type, as long as it helps to convey the information on how the system we are trying to create should work? It might be flowcharts for some, mind mapping, visual storyboards, or other things.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are. I think some of the easier or more simplistic tools have been forgotten and sometimes don't get used when a better tool is available. And I'm talking from experience here, where I see people just not using tools and just not knowing that they should be doing this.
Okay, if anybody has any further questions, please keep typing them into the control panel. Just to remind everybody that we have... Go ahead.
I was going to say they're good questions. I wish I could do better on on some of the answers. My apologies.
Okay, Graham, it looks like there's no more questions coming through at the moment. Maybe if anybody else has further questions, they could email them through to communications@EuroSTAR Conferences. Actually, we've just one more creeping through here. It's from Alexei Berdin. Do you or your company use MS Project?
I'm an independent consultant. I actually do use MS Project. Well, I'm not on any Microsoft scheme or anything. There are other planning tools are available, but I do use Project, yes.
One final question from Mike Wild. You mentioned another thing that has disappeared, continuous stationery. Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Fanfold computer stationery. I think it's probably a good thing. the amount of it we used to produce was phenomenal. I think there's still fanfold stationery printed around. In fact, lots of processes do. Sometimes when you get checks from companies, payment checks, they've come from fanfold stationery. It's quite common to see fanfold, but I think printer technology's moved on quite a bit since those days.
Graham, I think we'll wrap it up there. I'll just remind everybody that we have one more webinar in this series coming up tomorrow with Ruud Teunissen. It's Let Test Automation Play the Role That It Deserves. So be sure to tune in tomorrow at the same time for that, the final webinar in this series. We also have another webinar coming up on June 25th, which is in relation to quality engineering. More details on that can be found at EuroSTARconferences.com. Thanks to everybody who attended today, and a special thanks as well to Graham for his presentation. This webinar has now ended.